So we're going to begin on time, because that's always a good thing. My name is Gunther Peck. I'm the director of the Hart Leadership Program, and welcome to this really terrific opportunity to think about what I think is one of the most compelling and challenging divides in our politics in the United States today, which is the urban-rural divide. There are other ways of thinking about divides, but this is a key one. And we have three really wonderful people to talk about it. I'm not going to be doing anything more except to say welcome. And there are water seltzer. There is my favorite trail mix. If you are a fan of this, please get some out there. Also, I would encourage you, if you would like to join this table. This should not be seen as something we have to perform, but
this is the inner circle.
But it's a little more intimate, and since we are kind of smaller and we're a bit sized, we can have a really good listening conversation. So, yes, and we're going to pass around a sign-up sheet because we like to know who you are, and we're just glad you're here. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator for this event. Who I am so fortunate to know Adam Bachmeier, who graduated from Duke last year, and I've known Adam for some time. While he was at Duke, he worked at the Terry Sanford School, and we also had a different relationship. At that point, I was the faculty mentor, I'm not sure what that meant, faculty advisor to the Duke Democrats. I'm no longer playing that role because I have a different hat to wear, but Adam was the president of Duke Democrats for 2 years, yeah. So we had a lot of conversations about political engagement, what it is, how do you organize yourself out of a job, basically, how do you create engagement within the Duke bubble, and also on the outside. And so, in some ways, this panel is an extension of the opportunities that those conversations create. Adam also, more recently, has been, he won the Terry Sanford Leadership Award last year. Before he came back to Stanford, he was working in Montana. You'll see a thread of connection to one of our panelists, going door to door, and I should say ranch to ranch, what it is in Montana canvassing. So without further ado, Adam, take it over, and we'll have a chance for questions and engagement throughout. So.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I think I really want this to be a very engaging conversation, and really want a lot of participation from the audience because there's so many interesting and compelling questions that I hope our panel will be well suited to speak to tonight on this important issue. Just to introduce our panelists, furthest to my right is Jacob Bachmeier. He's originally from Havre, Montana. It's a town of about 10,000 people, about 30 miles from the Canadian border. It's really, having been there once, it's a really lovely community, and he is one of its great products. He was elected to the Montana legislature at age 18. He filed when he was 17, and he's currently in his second term in office, having just been reelected by a 60% margin as a Democrat in a seat that Trump won by a large margin. And so he'll have a lot of interesting thoughts to share. He's currently the vice chair of the House Administration Committee in the Montana State Legislature. And so we're really excited to have him here. Next is Kate Fellman. She founded in 2014 You Can Vote, which is a nonpartisan organization that works across North Carolina to help engage and empower voters. Recently, they were very helpful on Duke's campus, empowering Duke voters, but have really done a lot of great work expanding into rural areas, particularly in eastern North Carolina and some of the counties surrounding us, where there's been less engagement in the past. And they've also done a lot of really good work making sure the people they're registering to vote actually do vote, and so there's not that drop-off. They have a really great organizing model that people should really emulate, I think. So I'm excited to hear from her about what she has to say. And then Rachel Rubin is our other panelist. I'm really excited to hear from her because she is one of us as a student. I guess I'm not a student anymore, but she is one of you all in many ways. But she's done really great things and is going to continue doing really great things. I first met her my sophomore year when she was in the Soul class with me, and she was really into criminal justice reform and drug treatments and figuring out how to better help people that way. So she went to work in San Francisco, not a rural area, but for a drug treatment court, a family treatment court there, figuring out what best models there were to help people who were being affected by those policy issues. And then the next year, she went to work a summer in West Virginia for a drug treatment court there. And then following that, went another summer in West Virginia. And after graduating this spring, she'll go to West Virginia again in a rural county of about 10,000 people. How many people is it?
42,000 people in
40.
the county, 3,000 people in this city.
In the city. Yeah, where she'll be setting up the state's first family treatment court there, which will really do a lot of important work keeping families together and helping them access services they might not be able to otherwise. So I'm really excited for them to really talk on all sorts of sides of the topic of the urban-rural divide, from policy to politics. So I think I first want to bring it to our panelists to sort of answer the fundamental question I think that drove the creation of this panel, was we hear a lot in the media about the urban-rural divide. And I just wanted to see if you all could reflect on whether you think it exists or not, or maybe from your own experiences, how it's played out in your organizing work. If anybody wants to tackle that first, please feel free.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, Adam, for introducing me. I think that there is a rural-urban divide for sure. I think that the rural-urban divide certainly is going to be different depending on the region of the country you're in. The rural-urban divide in Havre, Montana, I'm sure is very different than the rural-urban divide in North Carolina. But broadly speaking, I do think that there is definitely a rural-urban divide. In Montana, the largest city is 100,000 people, which is Billings. And I come from a city of 10,000 people. And the interesting thing about my community being 10,000 people, it's probably the biggest town for 100 miles heading east. And then it's definitely the biggest, or heading west, and then it's definitely the, yeah, I mean, at 10,000 people, we're a pretty isolated community from anything else. Yeah, healthcare is something that Montana has been struggling with in our rural communities. Thankfully, in 2015, we passed Medicaid expansion. I know that's an issue that North Carolina is trying to tackle right now. But because we expanded Medicaid and have one of the most progressive Medicaid expansion plans in the country, since we've passed the program, there has not been a single hospital or rural care facility that has shut down. And actually, we've seen rural healthcare opportunities grow. So I think that's probably one of the most interesting things about part of the country I come from.
Thanks for having me here. So for North Carolina, there is definitely an urban and rural divide, and we unfortunately have not expanded Medicaid in North Carolina, so healthcare is a crisis in our rural communities. And so is the local economy in a lot of in our rural areas. Businesses can't compete with Walmart or Dollar General, so there's really an economic and health crisis in many of our North Carolina rural communities. Also, there is lack of access to high-speed internet, and that could be a real problem when we think of, let's just get people to, like advertise online for them to register to vote, and it really doesn't work for them because there's no online voter registration in North Carolina. You need to print it out, and so if you don't have access to technology or a printer, you're not going to be able to print out your registration form, and you have to go to your local board of elections or mail your registration application to your local board of elections, which there's one in a county, and it could be a huge county, and that could be the only early voting site in the whole entire county. And then when it comes down to, election day, if there's a hurricane or a natural disaster, which is also impacting our rural communities, climate change, people will be displaced. And then, if early voting was, that one site in the county you couldn't get to for early voting the early voting window, and then on election day, you're not in your county, you're displaced over the election day, you're just not voting that year. So the political power of our rural communities is not what it should be. And especially thanks to gerrymandering in North Carolina, the majority of our residents live in gerrymandered districts. So, they are frustrated and apathetic because it seems like their local leaders do not listen to them. But it's all because of the way that their districts are drawn. There really is no choice. They go to vote and they know for sure who's going to be elected because the district's seats are not competitive. So it's a really big problem, and it's a problem in our urban areas too. The primary is the final decision for those elections. So it's a big problem, it's a big challenge, and we can talk. I'm looking forward to talking more about it today with you.
Pretty loud also.
So I guess I think about the rural-urban divide in a number of ways. So when I got to West Virginia, I was coming directly from Duke, but specifically coming off of a semester doing the Duke and DC program. So I was going from DC to a town of 3,000 people, which is roughly the size of my high school, my public high school in California. I think the biggest difference for me, or the biggest cleavage I see, is the way that we at Duke talk about rural areas. And I think that there is an incentive for people to try and locate all of the country's ills in a place that feels distant and alien, that they don't know anyone there, that they feel they have no relationship to and no responsibility to. So specifically in thinking about broadband access, or devastation in rural health clinics, or environmental devastation, it feels really easy to reflexively say, move. Why don't people just get up and leave? And I think it reflects a misunderstanding of how people live their lives and what value people have in their own autonomy, and how we think about progress, growth without development. So one anecdote that I use there is with the broadband thing, I think that a lot of the coverage of the West Virginia teachers strike, for example, was very much about how they were striking for 9 days and they got the pay raise and it was great, and it was just that it was them versus the governor or whatnot, and it was just about teachers not being paid a wage that reflected the dignity of their work, which is true. But I don't think that there was enough coverage to exactly how bad the conditions had to be in West Virginia or in Oklahoma or in Arizona, lots of states that have followed suit, to push that in North Carolina as well. And in the county that I was working in, all of us applied to a school like Duke. You understand all the different things that you need to do in high school to be able to put yourself up for evaluation like that. And one of the things that's expected is a certain number of years of foreign language. There was nobody in the county that could teach Spanish, and so everybody in the public high school in the area was taking the same online Spanish course. The internet went down for an entire week, and their teacher in Texas just thought it was normal for this entire school of people to be 2 weeks behind on their work. But I just can't imagine how you prepare yourself for education or different opportunities, how you think that it's going to get better if you're kind of cut off at every point from different ways like that. In terms of access to vote, voter suppression looks different in rural areas. It looks like lack of transportation, lack of childcare, employers who are not required to give time off. So for people to access and exercise political power is not something that's just people being apathetic. There's a lot of different barriers in place in rural areas.
Thank you for those reflections. I think a lot of your answers made me curious about what the nature of organizing to overcome a lot of those challenges looks like in your various contexts. Montana, I know, Jacob, you have a lot of thoughts about conversation and listening, and I'm curious, Kate, for what your model is for working in a lot of the rural communities you have is.
Yeah, so I think that one of the unique things about coming from a smaller in terms of population, definitely large geographically. Havre is the 6th largest town in Montana at 10,000 people. And districts are cut up into about 10,000 people for a House district. I know here it's about 70,000. And I think that coming from rural America in a small hometown district opens up a lot of unique, interesting opportunities to communicate with your voters. So I believe that canvassing is very important no matter where you're at in the country, no matter what issue you're talking about. But I think the smaller the community you get into, the more valuable canvassing becomes. And with a smaller town, the more you recruit volunteers to communicate about an issue, these are your neighbors, these are the people you go to church with, these are the people that you work with, and I think in a smaller town, those volunteers have a bigger, more personal voice. And I know in my experience, I canvassed in my first election, my hometown 7 times. I went through the district 7 times, just talking to people. And coming from rural Montana, being born and raised in Havre, I think Adam had mentioned that Trump won my district, and that's true. Trump won my district in 2016 with 60% of the vote. I also won my district with 60% of the vote. Senator Tester won my district. He's a Democrat with 60% of the vote. Bullock won my district with 58% of the vote. So it's really interesting to think about, why are local Democrats doing well in rural America, yet Donald Trump is a Republican with values that are opposite of ours. How is he doing so well? And I think it comes down to communication and the way we talk to them. At a federal level, the more national you get, I think it's really easy to make a case that the Democratic Party has in some way failed to communicate that they care about rural America. I think they do care about rural America, but I think they've failed to communicate effectively. And rather than talking at my constituents when I knock their door, what I like to do is listen to them and hear them out, because I think the biggest problem is they don't feel heard, they feel left behind, they feel forgotten. And I think that's, as I've canvassed in rural Montana, that's the story I continue to hear. People are angry, they feel like their voices aren't being heard. So when I knock a door, the first thing I do is I say, what is on your heart? What is on your mind? What can you communicate to me that we can do better for you? And it's a really interesting experience now, serving my 2nd term, had the opportunity to go to my voters and say, what's on your heart? And then in the legislature, I had a unique opportunity to truly represent these people after listening to them. And then I had the opportunity to go back and talk to them again and say, this is the conversation we had. I remember talking to you about these specific issues and how hard life can be out here. Lack of access to health care, our schools are being consolidated, all kinds of things. And it's really interesting to be able to have those unique personal relationships in rural Montana and communicate with them and be able to come back to them and tell them this is what we did in the legislature this year. So I think in rural America, people just want to feel heard, and it's important to have these conversations with them and let them talk to you rather than us always talking to them.
So You Can Vote's model is based on developing local leadership capacity to have these conversations about voting and making sure people are enfranchised every single year for every single election. And so what we have done to not be seen as outsiders in a county where we've got one volunteer who wants us to come and they say, we need this here, we don't have anything like this in our county, and we're really excited, we want to do registration, we want to increase turnout. And so our model is grassroots organizing and using those local leaders and local validators to help build local teams of volunteers, and then we can support, mentor, and train those folks up and give them the materials and guidance to fully develop their own outreach program using our best practices and methods. And so with our goal to increase voter education and turnout of those who are specifically targeted for voter suppression, which is by our legislature making voting rules more complicated and constitutional amendments to require photo ID and things like that. We focus on young people, people of color, low-income people, and people with disabilities. And so targeting in rural areas to make sure that we are focusing on our population that we really want to help them increase their power is something that we have to be really good at. And so the one way we've targeted that population is to go to African American precincts on municipal election day, when everybody's out voting and everybody knows everybody at their polling site, because local rural folks know each other. And so what we'll do is we'll have one of our local volunteers and maybe support while we're growing the team, supported through traveling volunteer leaders, do voter recruitment, volunteer recruitment outside of a polling place. These are regular voters, and they would probably be most likely to want to get involved in helping increase voting in their communities. And so we talk to folks on election day and folks who will be most likely up for this process of helping expand voting and bringing power to their communities. And so that's how we do our volunteer recruitment. And at every site where we're working or door knocking in precincts to increase turnout, we are always asking people to join our team, because ideally we organize ourselves out of the community and we just can support the local people in order to get the message of what's on the ballot this year, why it's important, when, where, how we're voting, and making sure everybody is up to speed on this changing voting dynamic and rules that we have in North Carolina designed to decrease turnout. So it's our job to kind of counteract that by having a network and system communication to spread the word and increase the voter turnout.
I guess what I have to add to this conversation is more of like a historical take on what organizing I have seen done effectively in this area. I haven't been there long enough to feel that I am a participant in it, but it's been done almost exclusively by women and queer folk in the county that I was working in. And I think that people, what I hear from your comments is that people want to feel that they're a source for answers, right? That they know best what their community needs. And even if they don't have the language that we would use here, people can really accurately trace the history that they're living with, whether that's their economic history or their political history or their environmental history. They understand what the effects of the past decade or century has been on their lives. And they want to be treated they're a resource for knowledge. And so because they don't have the option not to organize across difference, you can't afford to burn bridges with people that you're going to see at the supermarket for the rest of your life, they understand how to work with people that they don't see eye to eye on every single issue, and understanding that you can love someone and disagree with them.
I'm curious, Rachel, how you decided I'm going to graduate and move to West Virginia, because I think for Duke students, everybody goes to DC and New York is the stereotype, right? And I think it's just sort of a really interesting question, how you became engaged with this community and decided to go back there.
So there's actually a pretty established history of young people entering the Appalachian region and dipping their toe in and being able to diagnose some problems and then going and writing about it or going and using it on consulting applications or whatnot. So that's how people expected me to operate. And I was very hesitant to talk about my experience in West Virginia either time because I still didn't feel like I had much to say about it or that I was the best person to speak about a lot of the issues in that community. And I really wanted to extend my stay the first time that I was there because the prospect of saying goodbye was really heartbreaking, because there were people that I built meaningful relationships with who I couldn't look in the eye and say something like, it's gonna get better, right? Because I was coming back to Duke and I was gonna live in Durham, which is a place that people are moving to, that exciting things are happening. And it was hard to tell family friends that they were going to have a positive experience in their junior year of high school. or like teachers that I knew that had been organizing in the Southern Coalfields, that they were going to get that 5% pay raise that they were promised, or that the public health insurance system like was not going to continue to deteriorate in the way that it was, or that mountaintop removal was going to slow down their communities, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not that I feel I'm going there to like bring solutions that don't already exist. It's that like really exciting work is happening there that I feel called to help with and assist with.
Can you talk about that work?
Yeah. So a lot of people have asked like, oh, so you're gonna go do drug policy work in West Virginia, like you, Rachel, you're gonna go solve the opioid epidemic. Cool, let us know in 2 years. We're super excited to see how that works. And a lot of it is that like the only way that people can get access to treatment presently is, so there's a very limited number of hospital beds in any rural county, right? And a lot of the time it will be somebody who, like, you get there through the state one way or another. So you're either picked up in an ambulance. A lot of the times people, if they think they're gonna overdose, will use it public so that they're more likely to be found in a restroom or in a Walmart or whatnot. Or they are ordered to go to treatment by a judge because they already have a felony charge. So there'd be people who would call our office and ask my spouse or my child, my parent, needs help, can you get them into treatment? And we would have to tell them, we can't do anything to help your loved one until they have a felony charge. So the idea of expanding resources in a state where there's like not a lot of money to throw around, it calls into question like issues of efficiency, I guess. Like that seems to be the driving force of like the Duke Public Policy Department, is like, how do we make systems more efficient? And that analysis is really helpful. But like efficient ways to use money in a state that has rural counties and urban counties would probably be to invest the most dollars in the counties where the most people are. And so if we think about like what other non-monetary resources we can apply, I think human resources are really important. And so like to every extent that I can, like I want to go help, like honestly, just like move money towards people who can be using it, right? And so like the fellowship funding that I'm tapping into like has no business entering this county, right? But I'm bringing it there. And I think that like if the cross-country team at Scott High School needs a new assistant coach that they don't have to pay, right? Like that, people get value from that. And so just understanding that like you can be an asset in like non-monetary ways was important to me.
I have a quick build-up of your comment about how expensive it is to organize in rural counties. That's what we have found. It is so much slower because there is vast turf. And so there's more travel time, and finding a lot of people really fast is really not that possible. I mean, we do hang out in front of the Walmart and talk to a lot of people coming and going on the weekends, but it is so expensive to maintain an organizing presence in a rural community, and that's why a lot of the campaigns don't do it. A lot of campaign funding focuses on the big cities where they can drive their turnout up, and unfortunately, the Democratic Party, they go for all those cities, and you see the maps of election results, you see all these little tiny urban cities being blue, and then the rest is just red because they feel like they can get their statewide overall goals met in the big urban centers versus actually doing the hard day in, day out, year in, year out community-based organizing that's needed in rural communities to really get the hearts and minds of the people and let them know that you're really working for them. So it's harder, and a lot of politicians in the last few years have just wanted that easy, win, and then I'll see my constituents in 2 years, and that's the only time I see them. So it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I might touch on that too. So after I got elected, I had the pleasure and opportunity to work on a few different campaigns too. Because I like door knocking way more than I should. But I worked in a primary campaign for a congressional candidate, and I was responsible for 19 counties in rural Montana. Like, Montana's rural, but rural Montana. I had North Dakota to Great Falls, which was probably 300 miles one way. And then I had south to a town called Lewistown, which was probably 100 miles south of the Canadian border. And this is a 19 county area, and I was the one person responsible for that entire turf. And then I went on to work for the Montana Coordinated Campaign, which is a part of the Democratic Party. They organize anytime there's a congressional or Senate race up, and that's how Adam and I met. We were a part of the same region. In Great Falls, they had 4 people based out of that office, which is a town of about 60,000 people. I was in the Havre office, and I still had like 4 counties, three or four counties, and Adam and I shared one county, but I was the single person along, 100-mile stretch of turf, really, and it is hard and it is expensive to organize there. You have to travel. If you want to organize, so if I was in Havre and I wanted to organize in a town, 60 miles down the road, I would have to find a way to, I would have to find someone who would be willing to accommodate me for that night. You have to make your own accommodations. There's a lot of additional factors and barriers that you don't have to worry about when you're organizing in a really large urban center. And then in Montana, it's also interesting because we have 100,000 people who are Native Americans and 7 reservations that are primarily in rural areas as well. And the fact is, you can't win in Montana unless you get the Native vote out to vote. And that presents a whole different, if we think there's a lack of broadband access and healthcare in Hill County with 10,000 people, go to Rocky Boy, go to Fort Belknap, and it is a completely different world. And it's sad because a lot of times voting is one of the last things that's on their mind. They're worried about how they're going to get their kids to eat out there. They're worried how they're going to get their grandparents out to a hospital. They have such a unique culture of taking care of one another. It's just hard to fathom organizing people to volunteer on a reservation. They have a completely different strategy for organizing those folks than they do in Havre or Hill County. It's just a different world of campaigning.
I think just a few more questions before we open it up to the audience, but I'm curious, Jacob, about how, after you were elected the first time, how do you translate that win into policy, and how do you work with folks from the more urban areas of Montana whose constituencies may have totally different needs than your own?
Sure, that's a really good question. Like I said, I love canvassing. I love talking to people, and in my district, you have a unique opportunity to get to know people and follow up with them the next election cycle. And it's important, in my mind, to view the role as both a trustee position and a representative position. For 8 years, my seat was held by Republicans that weren't from Montana. They just moved in, and in a couple years after they moved to Montana, they took my seat because the Democrats did a terrible job of listening, and they got lazy and they didn't knock doors. But I changed that. I went and talked to people and listened to what was on their heart. So it's important that you actually take the time to listen to people and truly represent them in the legislature. But certainly there are going to be times where you need to there's moral and ethical boundaries that you're not always going to agree with your community on. And it's a tough line to walk sometimes when you need to decide, okay, this is what's best for the state morally and ethically to do. It may not be the most popular thing to do for my community. And it is a tough line to walk sometimes. But I think with effective communication with your constituents, if you build the relationship of trust, they may not always agree with you, but if they know who you are and that you care about who they are and what they believe in, you have a little bit more flexibility to both represent your constituents but also act as more of a trustee in that position sometimes. I hope that makes sense.
I think, Kate, I'm curious about sort of similar, there being such strong stereotypes of what people in rural North Carolina are like, and I'm wondering if you have interactions or reflections on how you all have navigated people who are very different from maybe yourself, or what people expected them to be very different from yourself.
People in rural North Carolina are lovely. I am always, just impressed with how much, after you can build up some trust and people realize that, hey, this person isn't here to sell me on something, and oh, this person is really, talking about not just leaving after they get one vote out of me, and really cares about what I care about, because that's what we always train our volunteers. It's like, it's not about what you want, it's about what they want, and to help them connect the choices on their ballot with their daily lives, and how by voting in these offices, you're making, these people make decisions that impact your lives. And so once you can build that trust up, then the doors wide open, and you're welcomed into the community, and people introduce you to other people, and it kind of it snowballs, and they want help and support, and they want what Raleigh has. This is what I always find out, like, oh, you're so lucky, you have all these things in Raleigh. And so when we go out eastern North Carolina, the room is always full, and we're like having to turn people away or standing room only, because people are so hungry for investment in their local community. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to build those authentic relationships, but I would caution against any group in going in just to try to get a short-term one-time win and then being gone the day after the election, because that's what we need less of. We need more, glue and holding communities together and helping them navigate the civics and civic engagement in their local community and their state in order to make their life, improve their lives. We don't need them to become even more cynical because somebody comes in for a short time, one-time win, and then it, is gone the next day.
And Rachel, do you think you have times when you were doing your work before where your expectations were one way and they were challenged by your work?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, every month that I've spent there has been like a ridiculous exercise in humility. I'm trying to think of a good example. So the most political person I know in the state of West Virginia, and I know politicians at the state level pretty well, and people who have worked in policy their entire lives, is a teacher from Boone County. And she and she is 65, she listens to exclusively Christian radio shows, that she doesn't listen to music, she doesn't listen to anything else. And I interviewed her for a project I was working on, and I expected to have essentially nothing in common with her. And I started talking to her about, she teaches English, and I started talking to her about kind of her syllabus, like what she has her students read. And she was talking about labor history in the Southern coalfields, and Mother Jones, who did, in the 20s, she was responsible for pushing for more racial integration in the UNWA. A woman was responsible for pushing racial integration in the 20s in the Southern coalfields. And she was kind of talking, she started kind of waxing poetic about this legacy of women in the Southern coalfields, and she was talking about how she was trying to describe the strike to her students whose parents weren't always so supportive of, like their kids not being able to go to school for 9 days in a row. And talking about how she wanted to transform the organizing they had done to get all 55 counties in West Virginia to sign on to the strike to a Remember in November campaign, and trying to get people to understand that organizing around an issue is easier in rural areas than organizing generally to be politically active, like to just generally vote, as opposed to pushing back against pipeline construction or something like that. And her quote was, I'm looking for those politicians that voted against this pay raise, and Mama Rouse and Mother Jones are gonna come for them, and they're gonna have a come to Jesus moment. And I never would have phrased it like that, but this way that she was connecting what she was experiencing to the people who were kind of standing in her way, and how she was reflecting upon like the history that had allowed her to organize in the way that she did, really resonated with me. I think that I, more often than not, was wrong about an issue or the way people thought about it or the solution to it.
Curious if people in the audience have questions. I can keep asking questions, but there's so much interesting material to engage on, so if people have questions, go ahead.
If you can say your name, too.
Sure. My name's Emma. Thank you so much. It's been really informative and inspiring. So my question is about investment, and it's kind of on two levels. So on the sort of politics level, we were talking about how there's not really an incentive to organize and kind of get the vote out and stuff in rural counties just because you can get kind of more bang for your buck in urban centers. So how to kind of tackle that issue and how to maybe like change the incentive structure so that there's more investment in that. And then also in terms of economic investment in rural America, what is going on in terms of incentivizing private actors to have better broadband internet, or do different things like that to not necessarily like create urbanization in rural America, but to make people's lives better and easier and create more opportunities.
So can I do the first half of the question on investment from I know North Carolina rural investment, and then have you talk about part B. So there are groups that fund rural, there are foundations that fund rural organizing work. I think what we need from a sense of funding is for organizations to know that they're going to have the long-term investment behind the work, because it's not just a 12-month, it's not 12, we get you 12 months of funding, and it's like, okay, we'll do this 12 months of funding, but are we going to get funded the next year, and the next year, and the next year? Is it worth it for us to keep doing this? So, talking to foundations about, hey, let's do a 5-year project and really understand the community organizing. It's like a long-term project, not a short-term win. And there'll be measurable goals and tactics and strategies and outcomes, but they're going to be slower and much more, you're just not going to get the bigger, big numbers and metrics that you get from, typical campaigning in large urban areas. So we just really need to push back on our foundations and tell them what it actually costs to do this work, and that they actually need to fund for more than a 12-month cycle in order to see progress.
So I might ramble a little bit, so catch me if I start to do that. But I don't think that campaigning in rural America is as expensive as a lot of people think it is. It's certainly in a field campaign sense. Campaigning is expensive because there's a lot more work that's involved in a field campaign in rural America. But I also feel like field campaigning is more effective in terms of personal relationship building in rural America. But there's a lot of interesting things that I think a lot of people don't consider. The Democrats at the state level in Montana are buying into national data on the effectiveness of direct mail or TV or radio or newspaper, and they're pushing Democrats in rural America not to advertise in the papers, not to advertise on the radio, and they're saying that this isn't effective. But when you think about the difference of advertising in a local newspaper in Chinook, Montana, which has a weekly newspaper, or advertising in a bigger paper, it's so cheap to advertise in a weekly newspaper. You can run a full page ad for $100, $200, and the difference between a weekly newspaper and the New York Times is that the weekly newspaper sits out the entire week. And the weekly newspaper runs cute little stories about people's grandkids who won a spelling bee or hit a home run in their Little League game, and they keep those things and they put them on their fridge and they keep them on their coffee tables. And maybe it's not as effective in bigger newspapers, but also considering the fact in small town America, newspapers and radio stations are barely making it by, and they're an important pillar of that community. And so it means a lot to the people of a community when you invest in their local small town businesses, but also when you advertise in a local paper or on a small town radio station, they're also a lot more likely to give you free press because you invested in them. Democrats complain in Montana that, oh, I'm not getting articles in the Blaine County Journal. Well, maybe it's because you don't advertise in the Blaine County Journal and the Republicans do. Maybe that's why they're getting the headlines and you're not. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't consider. On a more economical note, my city of Havre, with 10,000 people, has $100 million in infrastructure needs. Our pipes are made of clay that are 100 years old. And I think for a long time, people in my community heard Democrats talking about an investment in infrastructure for bridges and roads, which is extremely important, and we must do that. But then they also hear the Democrats talking about spending $40 million on a dormitory in Bozeman, Montana, which that county has 100,000 people. And when you start to look at economies of scale, people in rural America, as far as investment in rural America, feel left behind because Bozeman has a campus of 17,000 people. My community does have a public university with 1,000 students. And our operating budget for our university is $20 million. And you're going to give $40 million for a community to build a new dorm. There was an article that came out this summer that they had just raised $30 million to build a new dorm. They had raised that money by themselves. And so I think a lot of times people in rural America feel like when it comes to economies of scale, we're left behind because bigger communities can raise money a lot easier than we can. And we have a substantial amount of infrastructure needs that aren't being funded and no way to fix them by ourselves. And we need more help from the state and from the federal government. So I think that's something I hear a lot of frustration about, the economies of scale of investing in rural America. I'm sure it's expensive, but it's probably where we need the most help. We're also seeing schools along the High Line. The High Line is where the railroad tracks run through northern Montana. Schools all across Hill County are consolidating, and people are having to travel 40 miles to get to school. It's a tough issue, and maybe it makes sense financially for our schools to consolidate in our county, but that's just another example of people in rural America feeling like we're being left behind.
I would say I have one kind of cutesy answer about that, but if we can talk about this later if you want. So, the entire operating budget of the Appalachian Regional Commission this year was $32 million. And Hillbilly Elegy, which was written by J.D. Vance, I can talk lots about that, but it was, the movie rights to that were sold to Ron Howard for $45 million. So, yeah, so I could talk lots about that, but I think that we should all think about what we demand as consumers, and how it will continue to be profitable to mine narratives of despair from rural areas, without thinking about where money can be effectively funneled. And yeah, that's just something I want to bring up.
And if you've read Hillbilly Elegy, you can read What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia as the counterpoint, counter-narrative to it. I'm struck by how much relationships are coming up because it seems so core to what everyone's talking about. And Rachel, you raised the notion of efficiency as a common narrative in policy making. And I'm so curious, maybe more in the formal political sphere. I just remember being so struck, my first ever visit to the Hill, I was going with the Appalachian North Carolina project I work with, and we met with all these people from Kentucky and Tennessee, but we thought we were meeting with people who wanted to talk about rural areas. They all just really are from Chattanooga and Lexington. And even our good Dems who we went to, the conversations were not interesting. The LAs were not from the States. No one could even tell us about the communities we were talking about until we show up in frickin' Shelley Capito's office, who was not someone on our list who we thought was going to be the warm, bright spot of the day. It was an hour and a half long conversation with the nicest, most thoughtful, educated staffers, all from West Virginia, all so interested in talking about real issues, because they're so much more rooted in relationship building that it just completely changed our entire attitude about the worthiness of that day, since sure as hell talking with Mark Meadows and Corker and nothing else was worth the time. And so I'm so struck by how much that office, that West Virginia sort of political space was so cultivated and so embodied relationship. And how I came away from that thinking about that as incredibly efficient, because it inspired a greater sense of sort of civic response. It made us want to deploy our resources and allies to that space. And so I'm wondering if you have other examples of projects, of community building examples or strategies where the time-intensive, labor-intensive, capital-intensive undertaking of building relationships has actually had an outsized, efficient, sort of middle or longer term impact.
I have a North Carolina quote.
Maybe it's Meadows, I don't know.
So I think that, just talking about your relationships, the people that we elect to the local offices, your city council, your water and soil, your mayor, your county commissioner, all those offices, the closer those people are tied to their constituents and their constituents are paying attention to what they stand for, not just saying, oh, I'm just going to vote for, the Democrats and not investing in okay, who's running, who should we get to run, who really wants to shape our community to what we want it to be. If those people aren't vetted and put through a strict local process to get those offices, then the higher up you go, the worse it's going to get. Because once those folks are then go on to the legislature, then go on to run for statewide office, and the further away you get from your local community, chances are the less connected you are with them, unless you have a base locally that's holding you accountable and keeping in communication with you as to what their local needs are and what your community is really talking about. So if you weren't good at that when you ran for local city council, you're going to be less good at that for all those other offices. And by the time you get to Congress, it's I'll just fly in every once in a while. I might move to Washington. So I think that local offices, I will beat this drum until I can no longer beat a drum, is that you've got to pay attention to these local offices and put the people in office that you want to see running and leading, and then, the good things will flow up instead of the bad things flowing down.
So Trevor Noah had this really interesting quote, and he said that state legislatures are like the minor league of politics. Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of really important decision making happens, yet a lot of people don't seem very concerned with legislative races. In Montana, we see a pretty, we do see ballot drop off, and people feel like their votes don't matter. It is interesting, the average race in Montana is won by 100 votes or less because of ballot drop off. And in Great Falls, where Adam was working, we had a state legislative race that was closer than 15 votes?
They lost by 5 votes.
5 votes. 5 votes. And my state senator, who's a Republican, he's one of the best Republicans in the entire Montana legislature. He's a good guy, but he won his Senate race by 80 votes, I think, against a very formidable candidate. And I think it comes down to a lack of communication. I think that although the Democrat was a really good candidate and he understands economic development, he literally works in economic development and infrastructure building in rural communities, yet he failed to get out to those rural communities and knock doors and make phone calls and hold town hall events, and just because of a lack of communication. I also think it's interesting, our Democratic U.S. Senator, John Tester, is from a tiny town called Big Sandy. It's about 25 minutes away from my town, Havre, and there's probably 300 people in this town or less, maybe 300 people. And yet our Republican senators are from places like Billings and Bozeman, and our Congress people, our statewide Republicans are from these big urban centers. And it's been really interesting to watch Democrats in Montana, because to win in Montana as a Democrat, you almost have to be from a smaller community and understand that relationship building with rural Montana to win. Because if you don't, there's no way you're going to persuade the people to vote for you. But they all start at those local legislative races and canvassing, communicating at a local level.
Hey, my name is Henry. Thanks for being here. Jacob and Kate, I was interested to hear you talk about newspapers, and you, Kate, to talk about local elections. Right out of undergrad, I worked with News and Observer for a while, covering kind of the Raleigh excerpt at first, and then Raleigh proper city government. And so I'm very interested in the idea of news deserts, and particularly with regard to politics. As you were talking about, or alluding to, Rachel, the ability of people to control their own narratives, first and foremost. Then, of course, the value of information, for people to be able to be well informed enough to feel like they can get out and vote in these elections for particularly smaller offices. So my question, I guess, is, in your work, understanding that the news is one of many industries that is becoming sort of, it's moving more toward the urban areas, or it's shrinking toward the urban areas. What alternatives are you seeing people in rural communities sort of turn to or develop or innovate that sort of allow them to, in the absence of the investment in for this news infrastructure, to, again, take control of their own narrative and fill these informational voids? Because I know people are doing this in informal ways, but I'm curious to hear what you're seeing about how they're doing it.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I feel like in rural Montana, our newspapers and radio stations do hold on because they are such a niche thing in our communities, and I don't see them going away, honestly. I think I've seen the Great Falls Tribune move more to a digital setting, and their newspaper is starting to decline in actual hard, newspapers. People in bigger cities are moving more to digital, yet in rural Montana it seems like the small town newspapers don't even have a website. They are going to continue to hold on to their newspapers, and and I think that's important for us to recognize in our state. But your question is more like alternatives to newspapers, and
Sure, and I guess understanding that, like, I mean, for instance, the job I started in doesn't exist anymore. Like, just because the resources people go, like, nobody goes to the council meetings for the 5 towns I went to anymore. Nobody's holding them accountable. And so, and that might not be the case as much because there's just not as much of a volume of municipalities, but I don't know, maybe it's more of a problem somewhere like North Carolina.
go ahead.
So, yeah, I know there was a new proposal by our legislature to not mandate that they put public notices in the newspaper,
Yeah.
which some people got notices, and helped the local newspaper. What we find all over is just a real lack of the kind of coverage, either by any medium, in a way that speaks to the voter, and that nothing can replace a one-on-one conversation or a conversation in front of a group of people like this, or a church, or a public school classroom. Nobody is talking about just basic civics education is lacking. We talk to people in rural areas, where we're voting this year. Yeah, we're voting this year. What are we voting on again? And here, it's like, we're voting this year? Is it president this year? No, it's not president this year. So we have to back it all the way up and just talk about what it means, what these offices do and why it really even matters on an off year for you to get out. And when a presidential election comes around, there's all sorts of media and TV around, the Senate, president, governor, people know about that stuff. But when you get down ballot, especially in off years like we just had, that there wasn't, this really huge office that was getting a lot of media, there's so many questions that they don't know. Like, I've heard about this, but I'm just not sure. I don't have a trusted source on how to find out about these constitutional amendments. And so we would provide that for them. It's like, yes, I understand. We're hearing over and over again that so many people are frustrated. Let me walk you through it. And I think nothing can replace that. That one-on-one messenger, and that, level of trust. Like, I want to help you really understand this because I know, the TV, you're not sure who's paying for those ads, and, I heard something on the newspaper, and I don't necessarily trust my Facebook feed and when I'm, my news bubble. I just want some straight information on what the heck this means for me and how it would impact me. And so I just think that work is just going to continue to be more and more critical if we want to bring people into the political process and not continue to have this erosion and apathy just because of lack of information.
I have a little bit of cynicism and a little bit of hopefulness to share. So this has definitely been my experience in West Virginia. So the Charleston Gazette, Charleston is the capital of West Virginia, surprise. The Charleston Gazette won a Pulitzer Prize in 2015. There was a story about pill mills, actually in my future town, and about how West Virginia got to be a place where there's a bottle of Oxycontin filled for every man, woman, and child in the state in a single year. And so there's really important investigative work still going on there. Ken Ward just won a MacArthur Genius Grant this year. In the spring, the Daily Mail bought out the Charleston Gazette. So now it's the Charleston Gazette / Daily Mail. And there are 2 editorial columns. There's there's physically on the left page and on the right page 2 different op-ed sections. And so even for people who are getting this newspaper, they are now seeing they're seeing a divide in a way that I think that some of the reporting there is more stenography, right, than fact checking, which is a different problem. But all that to say is that as people are investing less in local papers, it leaves a void for other people to enter. I would say that the experience of the weekly newspapers, I would echo what Jacob said, is that those newspapers are never going to report on somebody's grandkids. And so I think that there's some hope there that the paper will exist long enough for investment to come back should people want to. In terms of what is filling the void, this is positive or negative depending on how you look at it, but I've seen people use social media in a way that's one thing that surprised me, is the social media literacy of people in rural areas, given that they have access to a computer and to internet. But it's more centralized around a community, so how people will organize events or share news is based on just the people that they might see at the supermarket, or it's based around issues. So I can't recommend highly enough the Queer Appalachia Collective.
best social media
I
account ever
really, you
created.
knew I was going to mention
Why
it. So
Instagram exists.
it's pretty much, it's pretty phenomenal. But like they have been able to do unbelievable, radical and transformative work in just like, it just started off like them using this platform to share important organizing work that was done all around the region. And then they had a following so that this year they were able to do like a rural code drive so people could send in money or gently used codes that they just had like a Google form where people could say like, hi, I'm freezing to death, like this is where you can find me, and we could get them a code that like essentially would fit their needs. They also do a queer online recovery group because there's, like, I mean, it's addiction has touched like families throughout this region, and it would be particularly isolating and horrifying to go to an NA or an AA meeting and the first thing that happens you say, hey, I'm blank and I'm an addict, and somebody looks at you and says, is that the name your mama gave you? Because it's not a gender affirming space. And so it's an online collective for social workers who want to work with LGBTQ individuals, and there's like it's essentially like a homegrown like accountability network where if people can get to a computer, they can get to people who love them and support them, right? And so there's been, like, in a space that's geographically isolating, it's hard to be physically with people all the time. And so, like, I really can't emphasize enough the importance of broadband expansion because I think there is probably a higher chance for, like, genuine and meaningful online engagement in non-urban areas.
I would just add to that too. I do think we will see social media to grow in rural Montana. You know, you have such a huge state in Montana that it is hard to campaign and reach everyone, and so we've seen a lot of teletown halls with our senators and our congressional delegation. It's an easy way for people to reach a large group of people, including in rural Montana. It's interesting to think about that the Republicans in our state, being that Montana is a purple state that trends Republican currently, the Republican campaign strategy for our elected officials is, oh, I'm just going to do a teletown hall and that's good, and I can call that my campaign strategy. For Democrats, we have to go to that town and actually meet with people if we want to win. And it's also interesting because I think if you have if you have a Democrat and a Republican in Montana running both really good campaigns, filled campaigns, a diversified campaign strategy, I think the Democrat would always win. In my opinion, I think the Democrat would always win. But when Democrats don't do that town-to-town meeting with people in person type of event, we don't have a chance at winning, period.
So what does political engagement look like past the election? So obviously there's this huge push for people to get out and vote and kind of get their foot in the water with political engagement in rural areas. But what, especially when these districts and legislative areas are so large, what does like calling your congressperson or your senator or your legislator look like?
So I'm glad you brought that up because that's what I wanted to lead into with that last question, and I spaced it out. But in Havre, the railroad was traditionally one of our largest employers, and we've seen both like BNSF reduce dramatically the amount of employees they have, and with Amtrak, which is a very major part of our transportation system in rural and northern Montana. We had 2 people that checked bags in Havre. We had 2 Amtrak employees in Havre. And when Amtrak announced a year ago that they were going to cut those 2 positions, I thought that there were going to be riots in my city. I kid you not. It was a huge deal, and Senator Tester sent his staffers to a city council meeting to talk with the city council about what this looks like and what we can do. And Senator Tester personally called the CEO of Amtrak and said, "You are going to be on a conference call with our city council and my staff that will be present." And you know, I think it's important that you have representatives that are willing to go to community events and represent you. Another interesting thing is, have you guys heard of conservation districts? Yeah. So conservation districts are a huge deal in Montana, with being an agricultural state. I don't know if your Congress people send representatives to conservation district meetings, but every month, every single conservation district in Montana, you better bet that there's going to be a representative from every member of our delegation at those meetings, because that's where you're going to find our farmers and our ranchers at those meetings. So it's important to have staff that will be present to be able to attend those events.
I think
Are we,
squeeze more questions in.
do we have time for another question?
I think we have time for about 2 more.
So I have one quick question. So I just a quick comment and then question. It strikes me that I'm going to resituate it a little bit. Like we think we're focusing on the divide because that's the panel. We understand that it's real. But on the other hand, another way of thinking about what's broken in our politics is not simply a geographic expression, but it is that I would say local knowledge in cities or in rural America is routinely ignored and distrusted by national campaigns who have a deep and abiding love affair of big data and do not see relationships, do not see the kind of intimate things that you're describing. And so I guess I just want to, the question might be to turn it around and ask whether or not local knowledge, so-called, or local communities in rural contexts actually might have something to teach people who live in cities about how to fight back or to make sure that local knowledge is not ignored. Because this is the problem I have is that I'm in Durham. And you know, we know, Kate, the next national campaigns are going to come in. I don't know who the candidate's going to be. Once they set up, we are just, your voluntary contribution will be, here's the script, knock on that door. It doesn't matter if the street doesn't exist anymore. We care about door knocks. I'm still, it happens every election. It happened under Obama. Republicans and Democrats are alike in national campaigns. So I'm wondering if there's something about local agency that we might learn. Because I think there is something, there's really a thread here of a kind of community power, even if it's struggle that I want to hear about.
I would love for campaigns to hire local people instead of sending people from, like, brand new graduates from across the country and, like, great, you were a great political science student, but you don't know anything about this community and you're not a person of color. What really frustrated me, you know, nonpartisan campaign in 2016, but we would get volunteers that were so mad at the campaigns, and they're like, I just want to come do work with you all, even though I can't talk about my politics, because they are so unorganized. They do not know what they're doing. And I think out of the 13 or 20, I don't know, I can't remember the number of regional directors across the state for the Hillary campaign, there was one person of color. One. Look at the demographic makeup of North Carolina. And so all of these organizers and all of these people that got this, you know, experience, although I heard it was a terrible experience working for a campaign, were all applying for, you know, organizing jobs afterwards. And they were all young white people that were not from North Carolina. And I was like, you know what, I'm sorry. Like, I need people that are from the communities that we're trying to organize in to be the people that we hire. And so it does a disservice for long-term organizing if you're just, you know, dive bombing people. And so many campaigns and so many, you know, registration groups and national things, they do this. and we know we're gonna get dive bomb and paratroopers in mid to late 2020. And what I'm trying to do is prevent, is get all of our permissions and get all of our ducks in a row, so when those paratroopers are coming in, filling out the registration form wrong, because they're not trained, and telling the people the wrong things and not knowing, like, hey, do you know that photo ID is now a rule and do you know how to tell people how to vote with or without that? Oh, no, they didn't train me on that. So they have no idea. And it's, okay, so they get some people to the polls, good, that works, but, you're not, you're doing kind of a disservice to other people too. And then they're like, I don't want to vote because this person doesn't represent me and they don't know what they're doing. And it's just a loss of opportunity as well. So that's my piece. I feel strongly about it.
Yeah.
I feel like as a person who's campaigned, I felt like it was really important to be an organizer in my state for a senator who I am honored and humbled and proud to have as my senator, that it was important. I felt really called to get involved in that race. And after working as a Montanan on a Montana Senate race, I don't understand. I understand and I don't understand why they send political science students fresh out of college. We loved having Adam in Montana. I will say that. We loved to have Adam in Montana, but the reason Democrats, Republicans, ballot issue groups hire out-of-state fresh-faced political science students is because they can be used, they can be abused, and they can be expended. And it's disgusting. They work you 7 days a week, 80 hours a week. You have no chance to visit your family. They have a complete and total disregard for what's going on in your life. And they can do that because they move you thousands of miles away from your home in an isolated area. You have nowhere to go, nobody to talk to. The only thing you have is your work. And the work you're doing is important, but I think there's a certain reason why they hire the people they hire and where they hire them from. So I'm the county chairman of the Hill County Democratic Party. I'm the president of the Big Sky Democrats. I'm a legislator, and I've got several big roles in the Democratic Party, and they would not hire me for my position until I called Senator Tester and said, they will not hire me, and I don't understand why. And once Tester called the executive director and said, you better hire this guy, he knows what he's doing, he knows the area, he knows the people. Now I know why they didn't want to hire me. They knew that as a candidate and as a county chair and in these various roles in the Democratic Party, I was blind to the abuse they put people through, and it's disgusting, and it's not okay. And I think every campaign should unionize, and they should establish workers' rights for campaigns.
Absolutely. I've talked more than one field organizer off the ledge. It's really hard, and it's a really terrible work environment. And then, no wonder why they get out of politics and don't want to go to the next step, because it's a horrible job. That's not our work environment.
That's not to discourage you.
One thing you do. We'll just do 2 more questions real quick.
I'll do fast. I'm Caroline. One of the things I was most, I think, struck by, around the 2016 election, was the kind of somewhat mutual, but from what I heard, mostly coming from the cities and the urban areas, disdain or othering of people in rural communities. So I guess my question is, how do you bridge the gap, or even the playing field, or whatever metaphor you would like to use, in a way that doesn't look like exploiting political science students, in a way that doesn't sacrifice what is working and what is growing really well in the rural communities already, but is still helping get resources where they need to be and motivating people to go where maybe the most number of votes and the most money isn't, but like places that need it and getting people to go there who will stay or who will make a meaningful impact that like helps the community.
And can we get the other question first and try and link them together?
My question is a little bit different. So the conversation, which has been awesome, has been really focused on electoral politics and organizing and tactics. I have no professional interest in it. I mean, it's a personal interest. But as a casual person who drives through rural areas and someone who spent a couple of years in the textile industry and going to little towns that have been gutted, where the downtown area is nothing but boards and maybe an antique store and a Dollar General. And in the context of a larger society where things are aggregating in places like the Triangle, the Triad, Charlotte, DC, et cetera, where intellectual capital, financial capital, et cetera, is not going to your areas. I'm not trying to be harsh, but is instead being drawn to places like this. All right. I would like to know what you think really is the future for your areas, because I read people saying, rather than investing the $100 million in your community, we should give people subsidies so they can move. And I don't know what's right, but that's an interesting viewpoint. And so in addition to like, all right, everything you've talked about, what do you see as the future 10 years from now or 20 years from now for these areas? That's the bridge, or that's the gap that I see between rural and urban.
So your question was, how do we campaign without exploiting people? And Max,
Not even necessarily like campaigning, just like helping in whatever arena that may be in like action, positive way. Not like so much.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Just how do you bring positive change, whether that's in healthcare or like civic engagement or education, like in a way that is connecting, I guess, people?
I'll just be very brief and then I'll hand it over. My political mentor was an old school politician named Greg Jurgensen. He got elected in the 1970s and he recently got out of politics. And the state Democratic Party now hates him. They despise him. When you hear the name Greg Jurgensen, they shiver. And that's because politics, and I think this can be expanded upon to other areas like healthcare, and efficiency-driven metric models. The reason they don't like him is because he views politics as an art. And I think the state party and a lot of political organizations view politics as a science, when in reality it's a combination of both and should be done that way. There's a human element to what you're doing. It's not just about the metrics. And I think a good campaign utilizes both, rather than just trying to maximize efficiencies, because efficiency isn't always necessarily the only thing you're looking for. There's a human element to what you're doing too, and you can never forget that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, politics is about people. My mentor was Paul Wellstone. I worked on his final campaign. And yeah, politics is about people. And I think that, my goal with You Can Vote, we do volunteer leadership development through civic education and helping people understand their right to vote. But in every single training, you're going to learn how to be empathetic. You're going to learn how to listen to people. You're going to learn how to meet people exactly where they are in their knowledge and understanding of elections and their right to vote. And you're going to respectfully bring them into the process without judgment and without saying things that would be offensive. And so I go through this whole document that we have called the Eligible 8, and we mandate that people are respectful to our voters and meet them exactly where they are. And it's a process that people have to go through, and it takes time. It takes an hour and a half training just to get a taste of it. And then you've got to sample it in the field, working alongside alongside somebody who knows how to do that. So it is an art and a science combined together to teach people how to be human and interact with their neighbors in a respectful and compassionate way. And until we do that on a broad scale, until we make that an economy of scale of doing that, you know, not much can change, I think.
I actually don't think these questions are that different. So I respect the question about like feeling like the divide was particularly like thorny and disrespectful in 2016. Just to contextualize, like the county that I'm moving to went for Trump by 55 points. Like that's not 55, 45, it's like 72, 28. But there was like a voter turnout of like 49%. In the state of West Virginia, there were like 492,000 votes for Trump, and there were almost twice that many in Long Island. So I don't think we talked about the ways that like the enthusiasm for policies like that can kind of like be not so regionally like distributed, like even in these big blue areas on the map, like there's a lot of red there too. And I think that it comes from not necessarily trying to fight against really, really vocal and hateful voices in certain areas, but like tap into the political power of people who feel disaffected. In terms of like what's the future 10 years down the road, I don't know anybody who lives in Boone County who wants fancy shopping malls or like wants access to a world-class university like Duke in their backyard, right? Like they want clean water. So I think that it's not that we're going to have to get to a point where what I want is for that to be a valid way for people to choose to live. Like I think that it will be a national consensus that even if I end up living in San Francisco or Durham or DC, like I find it like morally repugnant that people who have always lived on a piece of land like can't continue to live that way should they choose so. In the state of West Virginia, 40% of the land and 70% of the mineral rights are owned by out-of-state corporations. So it's not even that we would now have to make a decision that people are entitled to something that like they might have a crossroads in the future that they wouldn't have like autonomy over. It's that people and communities have been consistently exploited for their labor and for their time. And in a lot of ways, what you're saying about textile industries and the decline there mirrors a lot of coal towns that I'm very familiar with, right? And it's really hard not to hold involvement in extractive capitalism against people who like had no stake in the decision making to like open a coal mine in their community, right? Like they wanted a job and now they're just trying to get pension benefits for the black lung that everyone that they know is living with. And so like their life should, like nobody is looking for luxury, but I think that like we as a nation should consider their misery like our problem too. So I think it's not that there will be a model where it becomes efficient. I think it's that we will see it as a moral crisis that like people